In the spring of 1884, Abigail was suffocating. She lived in a rigid, deeply conservative enclave in Massachusetts, where the air was thick with judgment. She was 29 years old, unmarried and fiercely, uncompromisingly devout. But her devotion brought her no peace. Her community was a place of endless whispers, where faith was measured by how loudly you prayed in public and how swiftly you condemned your neighbors in private. It was a piety born of fear, not of love. Abigail wanted something pure. She read pamphlets about the newly opened territories in the West, where groups of like-minded, God-fearing pioneers were supposedly building utopian settlements. She read an advertisement in a Christian gazette that spoke of a valley in the Oregon Territory. The advertisement described a pious community of brethren, a place where the land was fertile, the community was tight-knit, and the evils of modern cities were thousands of miles away. It asked for a woman of strong faith to join a respected leader of this new settlement. Abigail did not hesitate. She packed her heavy, dark woolen dresses, a dozen stiff white lace collars, and her father's heavy, leather-bound Bible. She believed she was traveling to the promised land. She expected a congregation. She expected a choir. She expected a white, steepled church surrounded by manicured fields. She found Silas. When the stagecoach finally halted at the end of the line, in a muddy, chaotic logging camp deep in the Cascade Mountains, Abigail stepped out into the freezing rain. She clutched her Bible to her chest like a shield. She looked around the settlement. It was a place of raw timber, cheap whiskey, and desperate men. There was no church. There were no manicured fields. Standing at the edge of the mud-choked road was a man holding a heavy Winchester rifle. Silas Vance was not a religious leader. He was a timber cruiser and a trapper who lived so far out in the ancient pine forests that he sometimes didn't to see another human face for 6 months. He was 36 years old, covered in dirt, smelling of wet wool and pine tar, with a thick, unkempt beard and eyes the color of slate. Silas had not written the advertisement. A dishonest land broker in Portland had written it, trying to lure settlers to a tract of useless land. Silas had merely paid the broker $50 to find him a woman willing to run a household in the deep woods. He hadn't asked for a pious woman. He hadn't asked for a refined woman. He had just asked for someone who wouldn't lose her mind in the silence. Abigail looked at Silas. Silas looked at Abigail. The collision of their worlds was absolute. "Where is the settlement?" Abigail asked, her voice tight, trying to maintain her strict, upright posture despite the freezing rain soaking through her black dress. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. He looked at her heavy Bible, then at her impractical city shoes. "There ain't no settlement," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "There's me, there's the cabin, and there's about 2 million trees. The wagon is over there." Abigail stood perfectly still. The realization washed over her like ice water. She had been sold a lie. She was 3,000 miles from home, with exactly $4 in her coin purse. She had traded the suffocating judgment of her Massachusetts congregation for the terrifying, lawless edge of the wild world. She did not cry. She tightened her grip on her Bible, lifted her chin, and walked toward the wagon. The journey to the cabin took 2 days, carving through a landscape that defied human comprehension. The trees in the Oregon Territory were not like the trees in New England. They were ancient, towering monsters, 300 feet tall, their thick canopies completely blocking out the sun. It was a dark, damp, incredibly silent world. It felt less like a forest and more like a massive, gloomy cathedral designed by a god who did not care about humanity. A pioneer diarist named Susan Shelby McGoffin, though writing of a different frontier, captured the sheer terror of this transition perfectly. When she wrote, "The prairie and the woods care nothing for our hymns. Out here, a man's religion is written entirely in how he treats the weak when no one else is watching." Abigail felt the truth of those words pressing in on her. When they finally reached the homestead, her heart sank into her stomach. It was a solitary, rough-hewn log cabin sitting in a small clearing, dwarfed by the massive wall of dark green timber surrounding it. There were no neighbors. There was no town bell. There was only the sound of the wind moving through the millions of pine needles, a sound like a vast, dark ocean. Silas carried her trunk inside. The cabin was exactly like the man. It was brutally functional, entirely devoid of comfort, and smelled strongly of wood smoke and dried animal hides. "You take the bed," Silas said, pointing to a rough wooden frame in the corner. "I sleep on the floor by the stove. The creek is out back for water. Don't go past the tree line without a rifle." That was his entire welcome. He turned and walked out to chop wood. The first month was a psychological war of attrition. Abigail was terrified of the environment, but she was even more terrified of the man. She treated Silas not as a husband, but as a dangerous heathen she was forced to endure. She clung to her strict, religious routines like a drowning sailor clinging to a piece of wreckage. She woke up before dawn, dressed in her heavy, dark, throat-choking dresses, and spent an hour reading her Bible by candlelight. She swept the dirt floor with an aggressive, furious energy. She tried to impose the order of Massachusetts onto the chaos of the frontier. Silas watched her with a mixture of confusion and profound exhaustion. He was a man of the woods. He spoke only when necessary. He moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency. He didn't swear, he didn't drink, and he didn't raise his voice, but his sheer, unapologetic wildness deeply offended Abigail's rigid sensibilities. The primary battleground was the Sabbath. In Abigail's world, Sunday was a day of absolute, uncompromising rest. Work was a sin. On her first Sunday in the cabin, she dressed in her finest black wool, sat straight-backed in the only chair, and opened her Bible. Silas woke up, drank a cup of black coffee, picked up his heavy felling axe, and headed for the door. "Mr. Vance," Abigail said, her voice ringing out sharply in the small cabin. Silas stopped, his hand on the iron latch. He looked back at her. "It is the Lord's day," she said, her eyes blazing with righteous indignation. "You will not swing an axe today. It is a violation of the commandment." Silas stared at her. He looked at her immaculate white lace collar. He looked at the heavy book in her lap. He did not argue theology. He did not yell. "The winter is coming in 2 months," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. "The fire does not know what day of the week it is. The cold does not care if you have a book. If I do not chop that wood today, we will freeze to death in January. God can judge me for it then, but you will be warm when he does." He opened the door and walked out. Abigail sat in the chair, her face burning with anger and shame. She prayed for his soul. She prayed for her own deliverance. She viewed him as a lost, barbaric creature, completely devoid of morality because he refused to follow the rules she had been taught. She failed to notice the actual mechanics of his life. She didn't notice that he always made sure the heaviest bucket of water was carried into the kitchen before she woke up. She didn't notice that when a mountain lion began prowling near the clearing, Silas spent 3 entirely sleepless nights sitting on the porch in the freezing rain with his rifle, just so she could sleep peacefully inside. She didn't notice that he never once demanded her physical affection, honoring a boundary of respect that many civilized gentlemen in the East would have violently ignored. Abigail was so blinded by her expectation of what a pious man should look like that she was completely incapable of seeing what a good man actually was. The breaking point arrived in late November. It was the season of the great rain. In the Pacific Northwest, the rain does not fall. It descends like a heavy, suffocating gray curtain that lasts for weeks. The dampness gets into the timber, into the wool of your clothes, and into your bones. On a Tuesday afternoon, Silas returned from checking his trap lines miles away. He was not walking normally. He was dragging his right leg, his face completely drained of color, his breathing shallow and ragged. Abigail dropped her sewing. She rushed to the door. Silas stumbled inside and collapsed onto the floorboards. His heavy canvas pants were torn open at the thigh, soaked in dark, thick blood. He had slipped down a deep, rocky ravine and impaled his leg on a jagged, dead branch. He had tied a crude tourniquet with a leather strap, but the wound was massive, deep, and heavily contaminated with mud and bark. "I need the whiskey," Silas gasped, his eyes rolling back slightly. "And the needle." "In my pack." Panic, cold and absolute, seized Abigail's chest. In Massachusetts, if someone was injured, you called for the doctor. You called for the minister. You prayed. Here, there was no doctor. There was no minister. There was only the howling wind and the endless trees. She ran to his pack, her hands shaking violently. She found a thick, crude needle used for mending heavy canvas tents and a spool of coarse thread. She grabbed the bottle of cheap whiskey Silas kept for medicinal use. She knelt beside him on the floor. She looked at the horrific wound. The flesh was torn deep into the muscle. "I cannot," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "I am not a surgeon. I will hurt you. We must pray." Silas reached out with a trembling, blood-stained hand. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was remarkably weak, but his eyes suddenly focused, locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "Prayer will not close this artery," Silas rasped, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "You have to sew it, or I will bleed to death on this floor in 20 minutes." pour the whiskey, sow the flesh. Abigail's worldview fractured in that moment. The rigid, dogmatic rules of her life offered absolutely no salvation here. The pious community she had dreamed of was an illusion, but the bleeding man on the floor was intensely, undeniably real. She let go of her fear. She poured the burning whiskey directly into the raw wound. Silas let out a guttural, agonizing roar, his body arching off the floor. Abigail pinned his leg down with her own body weight. Her pristine, black woolen dress was instantly soaked in his blood. She threaded the heavy canvas needle. Her hands stopped shaking. The terror was replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. She pushed the thick needle through his skin. It was brutal, barbaric work. Silas bit down on a piece of leather until his gums bled. His eyes squeezed shut, but he did not pull away. Abigail stitched the muscle, then the skin, pulling the heavy thread tight, tying it off with frantic precision. She worked for 40 minutes, her white lace collar ruined, her hands slick with gore. When she finally cut the thread, Silas had passed out from the pain. Abigail sat back on her heels, gasping for air. The cabin was silent except for the sound of the rain hammering against the roof. She looked at her blood-soaked hands. She looked at the man lying on the floor, clinging to life. She did not reach for her Bible. Instead, she dragged the heavy buffalo quilts off the bed and covered him. She built the fire in the stove until the iron glowed cherry red. She boiled water, cleaned the mud from his face, and sat beside him on the hard floor, holding his cold hand, monitoring his pulse through the long, terrifying night. The infection set in 2 days later. Silas burned with a raging fever. He hallucinated, thrashing weakly under the heavy quilts. Abigail did not sleep for 4 days. She fought a desperate, brutal war against the infection. She changed his bandages. She forced boiling willow bark tea down his throat. She bathed his burning skin with cold water from the creek. On the 5th night, the fever broke. Silas opened his eyes. The cabin was dimly lit by a single candle. He looked around, confused, his vision swimming. Then he looked down. Abigail was asleep, slumped against the wall next to him. She looked nothing like the rigid, pristine woman who had arrived on the stagecoach. Her hair was tangled and loose. Her face was hollow with exhaustion. She was wearing a rough cotton work dress, stained with soot and water. But to Silas, she had never looked more beautiful. He moved his leg slightly. The pain was blinding, but the flesh was closed. He looked at the crude, heavy stitches. He knew exactly what it had cost her to do that. He knew the psychological wall she had to tear down to save him. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. Abigail woke instantly, her eyes wide with alarm. She saw that he was awake, that his eyes were clear, and the tension drained out of her body so fast she almost collapsed. "You are alive," she whispered, her voice cracking. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at her hands, the hands that had done the brutal work of saving a life. "You didn't run," he said quietly. "There is nowhere to run," she replied, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only a profound, heavy honesty. The dynamic in the lonely cabin shifted permanently that night. As Silas slowly recovered over the next month, Abigail began to see the wild world, and the wild man, through an entirely different lens. She watched how Silas interacted with the forest. He did not dominate it. He existed within it. When a massive winter storm dropped 3 feet of snow, collapsing the roof of a small shed, Silas did not curse God. He simply went out, cleared the snow, and rebuilt the roof stronger. He accepted the brutality of the world without judgment and without complaint. Abigail realized that her Massachusetts congregation had used religion as a weapon, a tool to elevate themselves by pushing others down. They were obsessed with the appearance of goodness. Silas had no interest in appearances. He was the most honest human being she had ever met. He didn't promise things he couldn't deliver. He didn't hide his flaws. And when she was terrified and alone, he hadn't offered her prayers. He had offered her protection, even at the cost of his own blood. One Sunday morning in late December, the snow outside was falling in thick, heavy flakes, burying the cabin in a silent white world. Abigail did not put on her stiff black dress. She wore a soft, heavy wool sweater. She did not sit rigidly in the chair. Silas was sitting by the stove, carefully oiling the mechanism of his Winchester rifle. It was work. It was the Lord's day. Abigail watched him for a long time. She walked over to the small wooden shelf where she kept her father's heavy, leather-bound Bible. She picked it up. Silas stopped his work. He looked at her, expecting the familiar lecture. He braced himself for the righteous indignation. Abigail didn't look at the rifle. She looked at him. "I was taught," Abigail said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet cabin. that God was only found where people gathered to speak his name. I was taught that the wilderness was a place of exile. She walked over to the stove. She sat down on the floor next to him, crossing her legs, resting the heavy book in her lap. But I have seen more grace in this cabin, in the middle of this dark forest, than I ever saw in 29 years inside a church. Silas stared at her. His hand tightened around the oilcloth. He didn't know what to say. He didn't have the vocabulary for theology or confessions. He just looked into her eyes, seeing the profound, radical transformation of a woman who had finally let go of her illusions. Abigail reached out and placed her hand over his, right over the oiled steel of the rifle. "Show me how to clean it," she said. It was an absolute surrender. It was the moment she stopped expecting the world to be pious and accepted it for what it was: wild, dangerous, and incredibly real. Surprise flickered in Silas's slate-colored eyes. Then, very slowly, the corners of his mouth twitched upward beneath his thick beard. He didn't give her a sermon. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply moved the rifle so she could see the mechanism. "You start with the barrel," he said quietly. Abigail Cross expected a pious community. She expected a life of rigid rules and safe, predictable morality. What she found was a lonely cabin at the edge of the wild world, and a man who taught her that true goodness isn't found in avoiding the dirt. True goodness is found in the willingness to get your hands bloody to save someone else. Because the best things in life are never the things you ordered. They are the things that strip away your pretense, break down your walls, and force you to discover who you truly are in the dark. This story made you reflect on the masks we wear in civilized society. I have a question for you. Think carefully about it. What was the exact moment Abigail truly fell in love with Silas? Was it when he refused to stop working on the Sabbath to keep them warm? Or was it the moment he trusted her enough to let her sew his wound? Leave a comment down below and tell me your thoughts. The deepest conversations always happen in the comments. Let's talk about it.